The history of European colonialism is deeply intertwined with two distinct governance systems employed European empires: direct and indirect rule. These systems were methods of administration designed to manage vast territories in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and they reflected different levels of control, interaction with local structures, and methods of maintaining imperial authority. Understanding the dynamics of direct and indirect rule allows insight into the complexities of colonial governance and the lasting legacies of these systems in former colonies. The emergence of colonial rule. European colonialism, particularly from the 16th to the 20th centuries, was driven by various factors, including economic interests, national prestige, and a belief in the civilizing mission. With the rapid expansion of European powers during the Age of Exploration and the subsequent Industrial Revolution, colonies became essential for securing raw materials, new markets, and strategic military outposts. However, the vastness and diversity of colonial territories posed challenges for European powers in terms of governance. Colonial empires, such as the British, French, Dutch, Portuguese, and Belgian, employed different governance structures to rule over their colonies. These systems were largely shaped by the resources available to the imperial powers, the geographical characteristics of the colonies, and the nature of the indigenous societies. As a result, two primary systems of colonial governance emerged: direct rule and indirect rule. Direct rule. Direct rule was characterized by a high level of intervention by the colonial power in the daily governance of the colony. Under direct rule, the European imperial power typically assumed full control over the political, economic, and social systems of the colony. The administration was often centralized, with European officials stationed throughout the colony to oversee various functions, from military operations to law enforcement. Features of direct rule 1. Centralized administration. European colonial officials were placed at the top levels of governance, directly overseeing all aspects of the colony's administration. This included the establishment of colonial governments, where the imperial state set the laws, collected taxes, and managed trade. Local leaders or indigenous elites had little to no power, as the central government, often located in the imperial capital, made all major decisions. 2. European settlers. In colonies under direct rule, European settlers often occupied key administrative and military positions. In many cases, settlers formed the ruling class in the colonies, while the indigenous populations were marginalized and relegated to subordinate roles. The settlers' role was crucial in ensuring that the imperial power's interests were maintained. Number 3. Imposition of European institutions. European legal systems, educational systems, and religious practices were often introduced in colonies under direct rule. This was particularly evident in French, Belgian, and Portuguese colonies, where the colonial power sought to reshape the social fabric of the indigenous societies. Local languages, traditions, and cultural practices were suppressed in favor of European customs. 4. Military presence. To maintain control, a strong military presence was essential under direct rule. Colonies were often heavily militarized, with European troops stationed to enforce the will of the imperial power. The military played a critical role in quelling resistance movements and suppressing uprisings, as well as in maintaining order in colonized territories. Examples of direct rule French colonies. One of the clearest examples of direct rule can be seen in French colonies in Africa, such as Senegal and Algeria. The French government centralized administration and sent European officials to take charge of local governance. In Algeria, French settlers were given land, and French laws were applied, replacing local systems entirely. The indigenous Algerians were subjected to harsh discriminatory laws, and attempts were made to assimilate them into French culture. Belgian Congo. Under King Leopold II, the Belgian Congo was one of the most extreme examples of direct rule. The colony was personally owned by Leopold, and the exploitation of its people and resources was brutal. The administration was controlled by Belgian officials, and the local population was forced into labor for the extraction of rubber and minerals. The lack of any local governance allowed the Belgian authorities to impose their will with extreme violence and coercion. Indirect rule. In contrast to direct rule, indirect rule involved a more limited role for the colonial power in the daily governance of the colony. Instead of assuming full control over the political system, European imperial powers chose to govern through existing local institutions and leaders. This method allowed for the preservation of traditional structures while maintaining imperial control from a distance. Features of Indirect Rule 1. Use of local leaders. Under indirect rule, the colonial power would work with indigenous rulers, chiefs, or local elites to govern the colony. These leaders were often co-opted or coerced into supporting the imperial power. In many cases, local rulers were given a degree of autonomy to manage their communities as long as they remained loyal to the colonial government. Number 2. Limited European presence. In contrast to the highly centralized and militarized direct rule system, indirect rule often involved fewer European officials in the colony. Rather than direct intervention, colonial powers would appoint European administrators to oversee the indigenous leaders and ensure that the colonial interests were being upheld. The local rulers were seen as intermediaries between the imperial power and the population. 3. Minimal disruption of local culture. Indirect rule often allowed for the continuation of indigenous customs, laws, and religious practices. While the colonial power would still impose certain regulations and extract resources, local society would largely maintain its existing structure. This system was often seen as less intrusive compared to direct rule and could be perceived as more tolerant of local traditions. Number 4. Cost effectiveness. Indirect rule was often less costly than direct rule. By relying on local leaders and administrative structures, the colonial power could maintain control over a large territory without having to deploy significant numbers of European officials. This made indirect rule a particularly attractive option for empires like Britain, which governed large and geographically diverse colonies. Examples of indirect rule. British India. The British Empire famously used indirect rule in India. The British maintained control over India through the Indian Raj, which was established after the British East India Company's takeover in the 18th century. In many regions of India, local rulers were allowed to maintain their positions of power, but they were required to follow British directives. The British governed through a mixture of military presence and alliances with local rulers, such as the Maharajas and Nawabs. Though India had a centralized colonial administration, much of the day-to-day governance was carried out by Indian elites. British colonies in Africa. In British colonies like Nigeria, Kenya, and Uganda, indirect rule was implemented with the use of local chiefs and traditional leaders. These leaders were often incorporated into the colonial administrative structure and acted as intermediaries between the colonial authorities and the indigenous population. British colonial administrators had the ultimate authority, but local rulers maintained a degree of influence over their people as long as they complied with British rule. Comparison and consequences. Both direct and indirect rule systems had far-reaching consequences for the colonies they governed. Social and cultural impact. Direct rule often led to the suppression of local cultures and the imposition of European values, particularly in French and Belgian colonies. Indirect rule, while more lenient, still often undermined indigenous political structures by aligning local elites with colonial powers. In both cases, however, the primary goal was to extract resources and maintain order, with little regard for the well-being of the local population. Political consequences. Under both systems, political power remained firmly in the hands of the European powers. Direct rule centralized authority, often leading to the alienation of local populations and the suppression of native uprisings. Indirect rule, while appearing more flexible, still created a system of governance that ultimately benefited the colonial powers and perpetuated social inequality. Legacy. The legacies of both systems are still felt today. In former direct rule colonies such as Algeria and the Belgian Congo, the imposition of European institutions has had lasting effects on national identities and political structures. In contrast, former colonies under indirect rule, such as Nigeria, often saw the continuation of indigenous leadership structures, though these were frequently co-opted by colonial interests, leaving post-independence governments with complex legacies of authority. Colonial governance through direct and indirect rule was a complex and multifaceted process that shaped the political, social, and economic landscapes of the colonies. Direct rule involved greater control by the imperial powers and the imposition of European institutions, while indirect rule allowed for more local involvement, though still within the framework of imperial interests. Both systems were designed to serve the needs of the European empires, and the legacies of these governance systems continue to influence the former colonies today. Understanding these methods of colonial rule offers crucial insight into the nature of empire and its lasting impact on global history.